confirmation that Saudi Arabia will be hosting the 2034 World Cup. This was something that we already assumed was going to happen based on 2030 being played across 3 continents, kind of leaving Saudi as really the only nation that could take hold of the 2034 World Cup. And now it is confirmed, and it is coming with lots of controversy. As you can imagine, it feels pretty similar to when the 2022 Qatar World Cup got announced. And so lots of discussions around, is this ethical? Is it not? We're going to get into some of the details, but any initial reactions before we talk about the controversy behind it and maybe why people feel that way and all the different sides to it.
Like, I have nuanced feelings. I think we all do.
Yeah, very nuanced. But what we don't see is a lot of nuance. Okay. Mostly what we're seeing is one-sided viewpoints.
So what I've seen is a lot of like public anger and outcry against the fact that Saudi Arabia will be hosting a majority of the 2034 World Cup games. The reason why people seem like very much upset because of this is due to like a lot of the human rights violations that the Saudi Arabian government has committed against its people, against migrant workers that have been working in Saudi Arabia. And I agree with all of that. I agree that these things are atrocious, and I agree that Saudi Arabia has committed a lot of terrible things and that their human rights record is not great, and especially their history from a Western perspective of how they've treated women in the past is not great. Mm-hmm. So I understand the outrage. However, what I will say is that this outrage seems a bit selective, and my question is, why? Because the U.S. is about to host a World Cup, and as an American, I'm curious as to why the West is not anywhere near as critical of the U.S.'s record, the U.S.'s foreign policy, and the amount of people that my country has killed in foreign wars to get oil, which is kind of what people are criticizing Saudi Arabia for. Ultimately, every single World Cup has had some level of sports washing, whether it's South Africa, whether it's Brazil, whether it's Russia, whether it's Qatar. There have always been major issues around these massive countries who are able to pay the money to host a World Cup. If you are that massive a country and you have that much money to dish out, there are some issues behind the scenes. So then the selective outrage for why Saudi Arabia is getting criticized much more so than other nations raises the question of, is there xenophobia involved? And I'll pass it to you.
And I would even say, I would say yes, but not even just specifically xenophobia, but for me, seeing the 2022 World Cup being in Qatar, the 2034 going to Saudi Arabia, what Western media, you can clearly see is feeling. They're feeling like they're losing their control of the sport of football. And that's the same reason they have the issues with players going to the Saudi League for the club teams. So that's why I agree with you in terms of selective outrage, because everything you listed in terms of human rights violations, especially around migrant workers, issues with the treatment of the LGBTQ community, even just criminalizing sex outside of marriage, just all types of stuff, which you can Google, tons of issues. But there's tons of issues in America that you can also Google and that are going on right now within our country. And tons of issues, not just in our country, but what our country does across the rest of the world. Right. Very well documented. You can find all that. Once again, the reason I'm seeing such a visceral reaction, it's that idea of that loss of control, that the West doesn't own the sport anymore. And I think that's why you see such vehement opposition to it and not looking at the human rights violations in the country and outside of the country done by other governments that are in the Western world. Right. So that's my viewpoint.
Yeah, I mean, I agree 100%. And like I was saying too yesterday when we left, I feel like one thing I've been reflecting on a lot is just like the tension between like being a soccer fan and being able to like escape a lot of the violence that's occurring in the world, whether it's Haiti, Sudan, Palestine, the Congo, Ethiopia, like all these places that seem to kind of like not be centers of football. Like all the centers of football that we kind of keep up with, Syria, Italy, England, Spain, are unaffected by a lot of the violence that's like so prevalent on social media and on TV. And it's like, it just had me thinking about how the powers that be, these countries that have all this money, that have like the means to host all these events and stuff, have the ability to just be separated from like extreme violence. And a lot of that violence that we see on TV is the result of destabilization from these countries that we keep up with in terms of their sports. So it's just like a weird, I mean, it's not weird. It's like active acts of like just power dynamics and violence. And so I think kind of strayed away a little bit from the Saudi specific conversation. But I think it just
it's relevant.
It just ties into like how all this stuff works.
Well, it's a wider question. It's a wider question of like, what is the line between the immoral acts of a government versus sports being played in that country?
Yeah.
And we've talked about that before in terms of what's going on with Russia not being allowed to play any UEFA competition versus Israel being allowed. And then it's like, what is that line? Who decides it? Is it the governing bodies, but no one trusts the governing bodies?
Right.
As a fan, how do you decide? Or are you kind of more of a blank statement that, to be honest, every major country is fucked up in mad ways. And the sport is separate from that, you know? And is there a moral country? Who could host the World Cup in a moral way? You know what I mean? So just as fans, as organizations, as coaches, as players, everybody has to figure out what is the line to be drawn. And I think it's kind of a personal decision. If you don't want to watch the World Cup because of where it is, you can do that. But I would hope that you hold every single World Cup in every single country to the same standard of not committing these violations and not just doing it because of where it's located.
Yep.
Because no one examined America about 2026 and all the insane shit in this country and done outside this country.
And I'll just add, like, for anybody who kind of has just like preconceived notions about Saudi Arabia, I would suggest watching the documentary that they put out, Kickoff, on Netflix about the Saudi Pro League, because it's just a lot of information in there about like the behind the scenes of how this league was able to acquire all these players and like what their long-term mission is. Because I feel like in the beginning, and they touched on it in the documentary itself, in the beginning when they signed Ronaldo, when they signed Neymar, all these big names, everybody was like, oh, this is like a ridiculous project. It's never going to work. But a lot of people don't actually understand like what this means for the country, what this means for like the little kids who are growing up playing soccer, playing for a school, playing for local club teams, but don't really see a future like on the pro level or being able to like go outside. And so yeah, like what they're trying to do with soccer over there is a project that's just as valid as the Premier League or any other country that's trying to grow their domestic league. So,
and I actually went to college with a YouTuber from Riyadh. That's in Saudi Arabia, right? Yeah, from Riyadh. And it's not just footy they're growing. Their content creation is growing.
UFC
their business is growing. Their e-commerce is growing. Tourism is growing. Like they're looking to completely change that country and just business in general in the Middle East. So footy is one of the biggest vehicles for that. But this is an overall transformation of that area of the world that you should keep an eye out across all types of business. So,
yep.
Yeah.